Everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning for this week's Come Follow Me lesson with the Mormon News Report podcast. My name is Jenny Noonan-Dye, and I am joining you today from Provo, Utah, along with my husband, John Dye, who is the one responsible for all that you see on your screen for those of you who are partaking of the video live. As always, for those of you who are here live with us today, we'd love to hear from you, where you are, what stood out to you in your study this week, whether it's the first time or the 50th time you've read these verses, or even if you didn't read them at all. We get to as many comments as we can, just as we would if we were gathered all together in person to facilitate a good discussion. I'd like to excuse my co-host for the Mormon News Report podcast, Brent Malone, in Detroit, Michigan. He is tending to some family and church responsibilities this morning. And as always, welcome to our good friend, our go-to for all the nitty-gritty when it comes to our Come Follow Me study, the approved rainbow to our Y, the UCLA to our BYU, all the way from California. It's Ben Bernard.
Bringing a little bit less madness to your month of March. Absolutely wonderful. Good morning, everybody. Welcome again to the Mormon News Report, Hour of Power, as we like to call it, our Sunday school class, completely voluntary. None of us have a calling for this. We're doing it out of the goodness of our hearts. And this is our attempt to bring you a little bit of a deeper look into Doctrine and Covenants and our AP church history and all the fun, wonderful, exciting lessons that brings.
Absolutely. And I want to mention too, Ben, you talk about, you call it the Hour of Power, the AP church history. And I just want to make it clear right from the beginning that while this is a Come Follow Me lesson, it might be a little different. I mean, it is a little different because of the format alone, but than what you might get in another Come Follow Me lesson. We want to make sure that we make it clear that we want to make this accessible to anyone who is interested. And also what we tend to do here is we tend to take, some deep dives into things that maybe wouldn't otherwise be covered in a formal lesson covering this. One cool thing about the Come Follow Me format is that it is essentially an outline, and it gives some, whether it's freedom or just choice, it gives a lot of room for direction and as far as like which direction we take. And here on this, on this format, with this podcast, with this lesson, we do exactly that. We kind of take left turns and go, deep down, but that's what we like to do. Ben, it's something that you're very, very talented at, and we appreciate all the work that you put into it. And so that's kind of where we're coming from. Thanks to everyone, who's already chimed in, where you're watching from: Tony, Steve, Randall, Mary, Ken. Today's lesson today is Sunday, March 21st, 2021. The lesson today is called All Things Must Be Done in Order, and it covers Doctrine and Covenants sections 27 and 28. So, Ben, let's go into this. Just two sections of D&C.
Sections. I mean, what could there possibly be to talk about in just two sections? And spoiler alert, for today's class, we're actually only going to just dive into one of them, section 28, because the story about Hiram Page and the seer stone that he had, and how he responded to it, and how all the people around him responded to it, all of that sort of a thing is a beautiful microcosm example of how we as members of the Latter-day Saints can face challenging difficulties with church organization. And sometimes we feel disillusioned and jaded and frustrated. But then hopefully we find the redemption and the grace to overcome all of it. And we come out the other side a better person for it. The goal of this class and the discussion today is not to simply just say, here's what happened, everybody feel good about it. But I would like to take a look at this and figure out kind of what happened and what we can make of it, but then also zoom out and have a better application or better view of how that actually applies to us. Because we are centuries away from what happened to them and the world that they live in. But the lessons that they bring, I still think, are absolutely critical for us today. And so that brings me to a first question. For Jenny and for John and for anybody else that's in the class, I'd like you to think, if you're listening live or participating live or listening to this in the podcast, I'd like you to think of a time when you were disillusioned with adults when you were a teenager, where you had that moment where you were kind of like, I know more than you. Where you had this realization where, there's people that you trusted, that you thought knew everything, And all of a sudden you hit that point where you're like, wait a minute, no, you were totally wrong. But then were you actually proven wrong and you realized that they did know what they were talking about afterward? Can you ever think of a time where something like that happened? And you don't have to share details, but are you kind of know what I'm talking about?
Not me. I've always known everything. It's yeah, of course. Yeah, I do actually remember a couple of different scenarios for sure. I don't know that we need to hear the details. What about you, John?
Well, my dad had a favorite saying. He said, hey, make sure you hurry and move out of the house while you still know everything. Because at some point you'll figure out that you don't. And he never had to use that on me, but I remember that was a saying that he had. It's like, hey, you guys know everything. Okay, go take over the world, right?
Wow.
That's awesome. You know, and it's kind of funny how this is such a universal experience. And if anybody else is in the class, I hope that you kind of know what we're talking about, right? Either you have teenagers or you've been a teenager or you've dealt with other teenagers, or you've been in that situation where, you know, you start off with this childhood innocence and absolute trust, and the authority figures in our lives are the ones that have the answers. And then sooner or later, they let us down. And we realize, dang it, they don't have it all. And we have that sense of sometimes betrayal or frustration or straight up just anger or pride, or like, no, you don't know what you're talking about. And then it almost feels like almost like you're coming out of your cocoon for the first time, and you're facing this new world, and you have this level of confidence tinged with a little bit of smugness of like, I know what I'm doing. And it's a necessary, if not frustrating, stage of personal growth. So what the heck does that have to do with Hiram and Joseph and Doctrine and Covenants?
Now, when you say Hiram, do you mean Joseph's brother?
It's not Joseph's brother.
Who do you mean? This
is a gentleman named Hiram Page. Let's introduce you to Hiram Page. The story begins in New York, as all of this does. New York City, 1770. No, sorry, I was watching something else last night. So Hiram Page was just another New York farmer, but he wanted to grow up to be a doctor. He found a curious small flat stone that he thought looked really cool. And some people said maybe it was like a magic talisman. And he actually wore it on a chain around his neck. And he thought that it gave him special powers. And he would frequently use it to seek inspiration. Now, back then, everybody believed in folk magic. Folk magic to the people in the day was kind of like a Walgreens is to us. It's absolutely everywhere. It's beneficial in a lot of ways, but some people kind of like it more than others, and you only go to it as a last resort, like at 1 a.m, right? So a lot of people didn't actually think that it was an evil thing. Like folk magic was not of the devil. Most people, and remember, these are like 2nd and 3rd generation European Christian immigrants that have all come over, and they've brought their old world traditions with them. A lot of them viewed folk magic as a gift from God. It was something that a beneficial God gave to us. And there was not a single governing body, religious body, that was telling them that it was right or wrong. So they were just following tradition. And we've mentioned in earlier podcasts the mystical magical ability called scrying, which was the ability to look into a stone or a glass or a bowl of water and see something. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? Okay, that was scrying.
This is where I'm going to pause you for a second, because I've always appreciated in your pro tips that you've given us for studying church history, the one about how we are guests of the past, just like we would be in any other culture. But I want to make sure that I'm hearing you correctly. If anyone might be unfamiliar with that concept of being guests, are you saying that it was completely not just normal or, ordinary, but completely accepted for people to participate in this, what's called folk magic, and no one thought, that's crazy?
It was as ordinary as it is for us to have a small device the size of my hand that is basically a flat rock inside which I've put lightning and taught it how to think, and I now use it to look at funny pictures of cats and recipes.
Oh, I have one of those. All my friends live in there.
There you go. Exactly. I can use it. I can talk to people on the other side of the world. If I say, you know, what's the square root of 2017 and what's the capital of Argentina, it tells me instantly. I don't even have to tap any buttons. Yeah.
Okay.
So the world that they lived in, this whole folk magic thing was normal. Like there was nothing unusual about it. That's where they came. And my man Hiram over here was just yet another person who believed in that. Some of the stories say that he was wanting to grow up to be a doctor. And if you're going to be a doctor, you don't start off by going to old pioneer medical schools because they didn't have the same sort of pre-med that we have today. If you want to be a doctor, you go learn the folk medicine, which means you're going to learn what kind of herbs will help, what kind of tree barks are good, what kind of plant roots are good, when to grind them up. You're going to learn a little bit about astrology and astronomy, because if you grind them up or prepare them according to certain phases of the moon or the stars, that's all going to help. All of these things, the things that they used as medicine for the benefits of others, were all part of this. And this stone that he had was a very common, ordinary thing. Pop quiz. Who in the church, early church leadership, had seer stones besides Joseph Smith? Anybody else out there know?
I don't know.
I was totally surprised by this as well. So I was doing research and I'm like, okay, show me about seer stones. Show me people that had them. It turns out a lot of folks in early church history had seer stones, totally beyond Joseph Smith. So Hiram Page was one of the guys that he had one growing up before he was a Latter-day Saint. He had his own little seer stone that he used for inspiration. In his travels, because he was going around trying to be a little folk doctor, he came into a little village, Fayette, New York, and he met a family called the Whitmers. And they had a couple of boys, David and Jacob, and he became a good friend with the Whitmers, so good that he actually married one of their daughters and literally became part of the family, moved in with them. And they're like, hey, well, one of the reasons they were good buddies was both David and Jacob also had seer stones. The Whitmers actually had a couple of them. And you can see here on the screen, some of the images, some of these are photographs of the extant copy, or the actual real life relics of David and Jacob Whitmer seer stones, most of which are currently in possession of the Community of Christ, our good friends and cousins. Some of these are artists' renditions based on journals of other seer stones of people in the area. A gentleman named Joshua Stafford, who's just another guy that had a seer stone. A woman named Sally Chase, who had a seer stone. And the way that she used it, she said that it would glow, but she had to put it in something, and stop me if this sounds familiar, she had to put it in something dark so she could see the vision that was there. So she put it in a hat, and that way it would shine. And then a young farm boy that came over to her house that was helping work on the farm, named Joe Smith, saw that and was like, huh, okay, that's kind of cool. And she said, why don't you go ahead and look in it? And he looked inside, and that was where he saw, according to her journals, that's where he says, hey, I think I can see a seer stone for me as well. And that's where he got his, that he later then used to translate the plates. So the reason we're—
Can I ask a question about this?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so is there a process that we know, because it's not uncommon, we do, okay, today, because again, I'm trying to relate this to us today, right? And we dedicate homes, we dedicate buildings, right? Are these stones, were they dedicated to be such? Were they just discovered this way? Do we know that?
You know, it's hard to say. There's not a ton of detail. Here's what we do know. Joseph Smith found his seer stones simply buried in the dirt, buried in the ground, very unassuming. It's the kind of thing that you would easily look over. There's no records that I'm aware of him imbuing it with power or consecrating it for this use. It appears that the object that they had was inherently spiritual, or it acted inherently as a spiritual focus. And therefore, it would attune to whether or not a person already had a spiritual gift inside them. And if a person already had a spiritual gift and you paired it with one of these devices, then the combination of the device plus your gift, by the grace of God, would allow a person to do something, in this case, see things. So this means that other people could look at the exact same stone and try to do the exact same thing, but it might not necessarily work for them. There's one silly little story of Joseph and Oliver when they were translating the plates, living at Joseph's in-laws' house down in Pennsylvania. how he would take his seer stone. You can actually see a photograph here on the screen. It's the one in the very bottom left, bottom right corner, small, brown, shaped like an egg. And you know, some people didn't like what Joseph was doing. Some people felt like, wait a minute, we know that you use seer stones like to find like a lost set of keys on your farm. What are you doing getting a brand new gold Bible? What's that about? And some people didn't think that Joseph had the power to be a seer, because the seers were usually a little bit more well known and they had a little bit of a reputation. And so here's this ordinary farm boy that did it. And so Oliver decided to pull a prank on him one day. They go out to the river, they're taking a break, and they go down to the Susquehanna and they're skipping rocks like boys do when you get to a river place, right? And Oliver finds a rock that looks a lot like Joseph's seer stone. He grabs it, sticks it in his pocket. They get back to the house, and when Joseph's not looking, Oliver does a little switcheroo on him. He pulls a little sneaky, and he pulls out the seer stone, he puts a different one, and then he just kind of sits back and watches. And then Joseph pulls out the hat, and he sticks into the seer stone, and he says, quote, "Oliver, something is wrong. It's not working. It's as dark as Egypt in here." And Oliver says, "Ha, I fooled you. Here's your real seer stone. I wanted," and the other family members, they heard this, and Oliver's like, "Here's your real one," and he swapped it out. And then all of a sudden, the lights turn back on and everything comes up. And that was Oliver's simple little way of saying, "See, I told you, it's the thing. He actually does have the power. It's the stone plus him. It actually works."
Got it.
Okay.
Got it. With that image there, Jamie makes a comment, saying it appears that some of the stones were carved.
This is a really good point. Some of the stones, or some scholars have found that there is a striking parallel between Native American jewelry worn by chieftains as a sort of magical talisman, as well as a sort of armor. And there were a couple of sketches that I found yesterday in a historical archive that showed chiefs who would wear it as a necklace. And so some people think that these stones were hand carved, and then they were actually worn as a piece of, like we said earlier with Hiram Page, that he wore his stone around his neck as a necklace. And so there's a possibility that some of them may have been shaped by humans, some of them may have been shaped by nature. We're not exactly sure. So Hiram has his. Okay, so all of this is just kind of our attempt to normalize the aspect of having a seer stone. It's really not that big of a deal. Hiram joins the Whitmer family. He, by extension, learns about Joseph Smith. He learns about the Gold Bible. He learns about all these different things that Joseph is bringing on. And he's like, wow, this is really cool. Okay, yeah, I'm totally going to support you. I totally believe in God. He learns about Joseph Smith, who had his seer stone. And Hiram's like, all right, these are my buddies. These are my peeps. We got this thing. God's talking to us, okay? So along the way, Joseph is now translating the plates. Hiram Page was invited to be one of the 8 witnesses, and he was originally invited also to be one of the original 12 apostles. Okay. So when it comes to setting his place in the pantheon of early church leadership, that's a little bit of a background in Hiram Page. Okay, so with me so far?
Yes, thank you for explaining that.
Okay, now things get interesting because even though we had all the early church leaders, because they were humans, because we're humans, they didn't always get along with each other. Sometimes they would have bad days. Sometimes they would wake up on the wrong side of the bed. Maybe the cows got loose. Maybe somebody's feeling tired. You're hungry. You're dealing with the stress of trying to scratch out a living in the farms of New York. But even though they had inspiration, and even though Oliver and the Whitmers looked to Hiram and they said, "Hey, Hiram Page, you've got your seer stone. Can you get inspiration from this?" And he was like, "Yeah, absolutely." And he would receive inspiration through his stone. Now, there are no records that say what that inspiration meant. It doesn't say whether he was having visions or whatever. It just says he received inspiration through his stone. So, Doctrine and Covenants section 20 comes along. And we've talked about this in the past. That was the one that was kind of like the early church constitution, right? And a little bit of a problem came up between Oliver and Joseph. Oliver did not like the phrase in D&C 20 where it says, this is D&C 2037. I'll go ahead and read the whole thing. "Again, by way of commandment to the church concerning the manner of baptism, All those who humble themselves before God and desire to be baptized and come forth with broken hearts and contrite spirits and witness before the church that they have truly repented of all their sins and are willing to take upon them the name of Jesus Christ, having a determination to serve him to the end, and truly manifest by their works that they have received the Spirit of Christ unto the remission of their sins, shall be received by baptism into his church. So here's where we have a misunderstanding and a frustration between Oliver and some of the other members who had anti-papist views. They came from Protestant backgrounds. They were not of the school of thought where they liked a single authoritative figure at the top of their religion. In July of 1830, just a few months after that first conference where D&C 20 was ratified and the church is organized with the 6 people, after this has been come out, after this section has come out, apparently Oliver had been chewing on this for a bit. And he wrote a letter to Joseph Smith. And he said, quote, "I command you, Joseph, in the name of God, to erase those words and to change the word works to faith." So that way, when it says instead of to manifest by their works, they have received the Spirit of Christ, Oliver wanted it to say manifest by their faith, because he wanted to avoid priestcraft. He wanted to avoid any semblance of a person is doing works to get their way into heaven. After this, Joseph also announced to some of his friends, like the other Whitmer boys, that he wasn't going to be using the Urim and Thummim or the seer stone to receive revelation as much anymore. And David and Joseph and the Whitmer family start to have a little bit of decreased confidence in Joseph and his ability. And a lot of people start following Hiram's revelation, and they agreed with Oliver's desire to correct Joseph. And they had kind of this schism, that's trying to figure out who is what. And part of this goes back to the struggle of the organizational structures that they were in as a church. Okay, so that's a little bit about the history. Let's talk briefly about this organization and the religious structures that we face. For thousands of years, humans have survived in what we would call a patrilineal clan. Jenny, are you familiar with the term patrilineal? Can you figure out what that means?
I'm looking at this, and it looks like, let's see, that it would be like a body of many people in charge.
Yeah. So patrilineal, so lineal is line, right? And patra, that's like the same root as like patriarch.
Sure. So family.
Yes. So this is a family line, specifically through the father to the son, all the way down. So think Abraham, think 12 tribes of Israel, think Moses, all that sort of a deal. Okay. Firstborn son, all the way down. So for thousands of years, this is how religious structures survived, is that you were in a clan, you were in a tribe, you were in your particular group. But most importantly, you had the truth, and it was contained within your circle. You were the in group, everybody else was the out group. And as long as you were on the inside, you were part of the right group. Okay?
Sure.
Only as a very recent sort of construct have we seen the next sort of major religious structure, which was almost the exact opposite, which is what I would just simply call congregationalist, meaning it's totally decentralized. There's no one father that's in charge. There's no one single person that's running the entire show. So it's complete equanimity across the board. Now, with the patrilineal clan, God or the gods would talk to the father and share it with everybody. We see this with the Nephites and the Lamanites, right? We see this, as we mentioned, with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but the whole entire Jewish history. We see this with the Muslim history. That's a very common thing. Congregationalists, however, were totally the opposite of that. And there was no one person in charge, which meant anybody could have the Spirit. Anybody could have a revelation. And this is the world that Joseph and the early saints grew up in. How people would go to all these different revival camps. So they would go to churches, and if you felt moved upon by the Holy Ghost to speak, then you would stand up and speak. So in that context, it was not uncommon for Hiram Page to have what he felt was an inspiration, and other people around him to go, yeah, okay, that's actually not that bad, because nobody's really in charge here. Anybody can feel the Spirit. And that's kind of what we see. Their justification for this was in the book of Acts in the Bible, on the day of the Pentecost, when the Spirit came down and talked to everybody, it doesn't say the Spirit came down and it ordained Peter, James, and John as the first presidency of the church and everything. It says the Spirit came down and talked to everybody, and everybody spoke by the Spirit of God. So I hope that we have just a little bit of I would say, grace and forgiving and forbearance for Hiram and the other people that did not immediately latch onto the idea that Joseph Smith was the one solid leader. Because that next sort of religious structure that comes later on for us is a very modern construct. And this is where we are now today, where I would simply call it the corporate body construct. It looks like an organization chart. So this is all about streamlining communication from the top all the way down. If the patrilineal clan is about containing it, Congregationalist is decentralizing it, then a corporate body helps it get from one end to the other. Okay, does that all make sense so far?
I think so. I think it's interesting. You know, the patrilineal clan. Tony makes the point that that's one of the reasons the RLDS was formed, and that's true, because they thought that it should continue on down the line. And also, as I'm looking at this awesome graphic that you've made here, the corporate body, it just makes me wonder, though, how many in the corporate body could also be related, kind of almost like a combination of the two.
Absolutely. And you know, as much as, you know, I'll throw these three images up here, and there's not always a clear delineation between one and the other, right? It's like there's pros and cons of doing each one. And I think that when you look at any particular religious structure, you're going to find elements of each, right? There's a little bit of the patrilineal. There's a little bit of the father to son. You know, even in our own church today, we may be organized on paper like a corporate body, but we try to encourage people to have the Spirit in their own life, you know, church support, home-centered, church supported, like a Congregationalist. And then at the same time, there is a reality of some patrilineal elements of, you say, Joseph Smith Sr., and then Joseph F. Smith, and then Joseph Fielding Smith, and all the way down, right? You know, you go to BYU, you talk to BYU faculty about the McConkey line, and there are McConkeys that have been there for, you know, for generations. And that's just part of the way that it is, okay? So part of this is to help us understand the context where he is. And so this is where Hiram Page is going on and where he's sharing this information. So now we have problems with revelations. So the problem that arises here, and this is one thing that I really want to hope that the audience members understand. The problem with the Hiram Page was not the fact that he had his own seer stone. If I could be perfectly honest, when I was a kid, I grew up in Utah, and I was taught that the problem was the fact that Hiram used a seer stone, and those were witchcraft and those were of the devil. And that was a bad thing. And when I was a trusting kid, I was like, okay, sure, I'll trust you. But then I learned that Joseph Smith had a seer stone, and I'm like, wait a minute, that's not. So the problem is not Hiram's use of the seer stone. The problem was his trying to tell Joseph and Oliver and everybody else how to run this whole thing. And I look at this as just a normal struggle with figuring out traditions and trying to accept this new structure. The stones weren't bad, but the confusion as to who should be correcting whom and how to lead was part of the problem. So here's where we see the resolution that comes around. The resolution did not come when we say, hey, let's go through and say, I'm in charge. And this is one of the pitfalls that we have to be aware of as a Latter-day Saint. That Joseph could have easily said, I'm in charge and everybody else has to do what I say. And now that we are part of this corporate body, this is what I'm going to call a pitfall warning. And I think we're going to add this to our pro tips for studying church history. These are some pitfalls that I think are very helpful to be aware of as Latter-day Saints, as part of the Mormon tradition and as good, faithful disciples of Christ. We have to be aware of a pitfall that is so common to fall into. And that is, our church organizational hierarchy does not presuppose one-way communication from the top down when it comes to decisions or feedback or correction or counsel. We don't have to assume that just because we're in a hierarchy that everything always has to start at the top and go all the way down. So in this case, yes, there is some benefit to Joseph and Oliver Oliver and Hiram and the Whitmers helping Joseph be more clear in his scriptures. But we shouldn't fall into the trap of saying, oh, well, because we're in this organizational structure about the prophet at top, he makes all the decisions and everybody else has to get in line. Nobody else is allowed to share their feedback, and any inspiration always comes from the top and trickles all the way down, right?
Okay. Okay. So meaning, I mean, because there are things in the church, but then there are other things. As I turn to DNC 28, it says let's see, where did it go? I think my screen moved. So it's talking about it says in verse 12, for behold, these things have not been appointed unto him, meaning the stone, right?
Yep.
Have not been appointed unto him, neither shall anything be appointed unto any of this church contrary to the church covenants. For all things must be done in order and by common consent in the church by the prayer of faith. And so what's being said here is not that those things wouldn't be appointed at all, but that one specifically was not appointed to him. So he can have his own revelation for the things over which he has stewardship, but that's not what this is. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess the point that I'm trying to make here is that it's okay for everybody else underneath to have revelation and to share it with others. That a little bit of congregationalist is a good thing. Now, we're not saying to totally like rebel and push all the way up. What this story says is Joseph Smith is the prophet, not Oliver and not Hiram. But that's what the story says, right? Joseph Smith is the prophet, not Hiram Page. But what we hear in the story can sometimes sound like Joseph gets revelations, not you. He makes decisions, not you. Your personal revelation takes a back seat to his revelation. So this story of Hiram Page can be easily misunderstood or misconstrued. Yes, it is a lesson in church organization, but if we stretch it too far, and if we use this lesson to kind of browbeat a pyramidal structure and say, that's the point of this, is that you need to follow the prophet and everybody else get in line, then we use it to enforce a strict, rigid roles that actually cause us to miss out on greater light and knowledge. And that's not what we're trying to go for. Can we show this quote that I found from M. Russell Ballard on Counseling with Our Counsels? John, would you mind pulling that up? Okay. Jenny, could I ask you to read this? Would this be okay?
Yeah, of course.
This is LDS Conference. This was General Conference in April 1994. M. Russell Ballard of the Quorum of the 12 said the following.
Way back in the 1900s.
Whew.
Elder Ballard says, during training sessions I have conducted in various locations since last General Conference, I have focused attention on the Ward Council. As part of that training, I invited a Ward Council to participate. I gave to the bishop a theoretical problem about a less active family and asked him to use the Ward Council to develop a plan to activate this family. Without exception, the bishop took charge of the situation immediately and said, here's the problem and here's what I think we should do to solve it. Then he made assignments to the various Ward Council members. This was a good exercise in delegation, I suppose, but it did not even begin to use the experience and wisdom of council members to address the problem. Eventually, I asked the bishop to try again, only this time to solicit ideas and recommendations from his council members before making any assignments. I especially encouraged him to ask the sisters for their ideas. When the bishop opened the meeting to council members and invited them to council together, the effect was like opening the floodgates of heaven. A reservoir of insight and inspiration suddenly began to flow between council members as they planned for fellowshipping the less active family.
So, what are your thoughts on this little story, this little vignette that he shares?
Mine?
Yeah.
Well, I there's just such wisdom in that, because much like you were talking about earlier about when we were all kind of obstinate teenagers and we thought we knew everything, right? Other people have other perspectives that we just don't. And similarly, we have more perspective. We hopefully gain more perspective as time goes on in our lives, as we gain age, experience, hopefully wisdom along with those things. And because of that, I mean, let's take that very example that he's given he has given a hypothetical situation, President Ballard has, to these bishops and these ward councils. There's a less active family. Well, guess what? Maybe that particular bishop has never had an experience being a member of a less active family, but someone else in that council, in the room where it happens, might have experience being, I can't help myself, might have experience being or having been, a member of a less active family. And so they would know just from their own personal experience whether the suggestion from the bishop and the subsequent assignments might be effective. To extend it even further, there could very well be more than one person in that room where they also were a member of a less active family that had a very different experience than the first. And so it's from, the collaboration of wisdom and experience that really, like he said, opened the floodgates of possibilities rather than just having the information from one source.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing. This entire story of Hiram Page and everybody else trying to find their place in the structure, I see this as kind of a microcosm of our own spiritual voyage. I mean,
can I add one more thing?
Yeah.
Because I think it's very significant that he also said specifically to ask the sisters.
Bingo.
Because being a sister, if I may, there are things, and I mean this in no sort of man-hating way, there are things that men simply don't think about.
What?
Yep, sorry. And especially when it comes to not just the caring and nurturing aspects of life, but also the practicalities of making things happen. I've been very grateful for people who have come to me to ask questions for situations for which I've had experience. For instance, a sister that I know is about to become a single mom. What do you think is something that we could best do to help her? That sort of thing. Uh-huh. And so because of that, I mean, those are examples where many voices in the room, many voices at the table are always valuable, but eliminating the voice of basically representation of half the population does no one any good.
Yeah. It's almost like we need each other. Like we have to complement and figure out how to work this out. Right? Yeah.
Sure. Equally yoked even. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, sure. Next time we meet somebody, we'll make sure that there's more women in the sequel something. Okay. That was weak. But anyway, work. So the point of all of this with Hiram and everybody, we are trying to go through this journey of figuring out our place. And we're not always going to get it right the first time. And chances are that we may know somebody like maybe the Hiram Pages or the Oliver. And just to wrap up his storyline, Section 28 is actually quite fascinating because Joseph Smith did not go to Hiram Page and say, here's the answer, sit down, shut up, let me tell you what's going on. If you look closely at the header to Section 28, this was a revelation that came through Joseph Smith to Oliver Cowdery. And then Oliver Cowdery was instructed to go talk to Hiram and to work it out. So whereas Oliver was originally part of the problem, he was also invited to be part of the solution. And the journals talk about how he sat down and he had to figure out for himself what this meant and realize, okay, it looks like Joseph is the first elder of the church, so he should be the only one receiving revelation. So we're going to let him do it. And then my job is to be the Aaron to his Moses. I'm to help him out and support him. I'm not going to bring forth new stuff since he's going to be the main guy. And then once Oliver had himself squared away, we had to take that to Hiram and the rest of the Whitmers. And thankfully, it had a happy ending. At the following conference in September of that year, everybody raised their hands and they all sustained and said, okay, Joseph, we'll go ahead and support you as being the guy in charge. All the rest of us can support you in that. Now, this should not be viewed as muzzling Hiram or Oliver or the rest of the Whitmers so much as it is everybody figuring out their job on the team. Whether it's a basketball or football or soccer team or dance company or whatever, everybody has a different job. And that's okay. And we only work together if everybody learns what their different jobs are, so you can all push towards the goal. And that's kind of what this story was. But chances are that if we zoom out and we apply this to ourselves in a little bit more modern situation, I think there are some characteristics of Hiram Page's and Oliver's and the Whitmer's faith journey that are universal to all of us. Chances are that you, Jenny, or anybody else listening, chances are that you have gone through a faith crisis of sorts, or you know somebody who's gone through a faith crisis, or you've hit a point where your perspective on either church leadership or church history or whatever, your perspective has been challenged. I'm not going to ask for any details, but do you kind of know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so this is a common, usual, normal, ordinary thing. Again, part of this, the theme today is let's normalize the things that are kind of out there, right? So you've probably know somebody who's gone through that crisis, and when that faith and confidence and that perspective is shaken, I think we really need to learn how to navigate these rough waters. Now, of course, the primary answers always apply, right? Read, pray, have faith. Those are good starting points, but those should not be the finish lines. And unfortunately, sometimes in our tradition, sometimes we reduce it to the primary answers and we stop there. We say that's all you have to do. Hiram, in this case, was not told to just sit down and shut up. He had to work it out, and so should we. And here is a beautiful quote that I absolutely love that I think can help us understand how to work out these challenges. John, do you want to pull up that quote I have in the quote bubble? Okay, Jenny, would you mind reading this for us?
Not a bit. The day the child realizes that all adults are imperfect, he becomes an adolescent. The day he forgives them, he becomes an adult. The day he forgives himself, he becomes wise.
Ooh. Okay, let's unpack this one. What does that mean to you?
Oh gosh. I mean,
How much time we got, right?
Honestly, I mean, it's true, because when you're little, when you're we're born into this world completely dependent upon the adults around us. And as we are being acclimated to this world, of course, we think that what we are being told, what we are living is not only normal, but correct. And so that first part, the day the child realizes that all adults are imperfect, he becomes an adolescent. I mean, like we mentioned at the very beginning, it's not uncommon for teenagers to have this kind of mentality. And if I may, it's funny, I was looking at my Facebook memories a couple of like last week, right before one of my daughter's birthdays, and I posted on Facebook. This was a little over 4 years ago. I'll post about it with pictures tomorrow when I see her, but for now, I'll say it like this. Starting today and for the next 7 years, I will have 3 teenagers. And not only that, but I realized this morning, getting ready, that in a month from today, we'll have 4 teenagers for at least until September. So all that to be said, or all that to say that if you don't have the pleasure of dealing and interacting with teenagers on a regular basis at this point, hopefully you can remember what it was like to be one, and exactly that aspect of it, of realizing that the adults around you are in fact imperfect. I like the day he forgives them, he becomes an adult, because there is an aspect of that to not just time and life, but maturity, right? Like, oh my goodness, my parent or my teacher was the age that I am now when I experienced this on the other side of it. And hopefully, you can give some grace. I did have an experience a couple of years ago where my young woman president, when I was growing up in New York, had come out to Utah, and we went to lunch together. And I just very frankly and very plainly apologized to her for my nonsense. Having now, spent some time as a young woman leader, and she just laughed, and I'm very grateful for that. But then the part that I think actually might be the most difficult is that last part of your quote that you shared, Ben. The day he forgives himself, he becomes wise. Ooh. Because we really, I mean, it almost seems like a battle starting at that first change of realizing that adults are imperfect. We may think that we do know everything. And then as we get older, we realize we sure don't. And just that we have to forgive ourselves for that.
Yeah, absolutely. John, can you pull up the picture I have with the graph? So I was thinking about this visually, as I'm wont to do, and I realized that there's this beautiful inverse relationship between how much trust we have of adults and how much we know. I think when we are a kid, our trust in adults is high, right? It's super, super high. And that's the DNA caveman inside us that it's built to that. We trust those people and we know very little. And eventually our knowledge will grow and we hit this crossover point where we start to know so much that our amount of what we think we know goes higher than our trust. And that's when I think we hit that adolescent phase. I visualize that's this moment of, oh my gosh, I know more than you. And then as our knowledge continues to increase, we hit this kind of weird middle part where this frustration and angsty teenage yuckiness is so prevalent in our lives. John, if you wouldn't go ahead and advance to the next one. I think this kind of sums up in one way of showing a childhood phase development versus adolescent versus adulthood. And what I think is interesting about this is that this is not necessarily biologically chronological. This is more emotional development. There are some people that remain in this emotional childhood stage for their entire life. They don't know a ton and they're very trusting, and that's wonderful. God bless them. That's awesome. There are some people that hit that crossover point into emotional adolescence and likewise stay there for the rest of their lives. And I think the final inflection point at the end, where as our knowledge increases and we hit a point where we trust the person more, that's when wisdom starts to unfold and we start to step into this area of emotional adulthood. And from there, where we realize that it's possible to be more accepting and graceful with the knowledge that we have without necessarily forgetting everything that we had before. So, and then the piece that's not drawn here, but is implied by the upward pointing arrows at the very end, is the wisdom. And that's where wisdom comes, is where we realize that it's an onward journey of not only learning this continually on our own, but teaching it to others and forgiving ourselves along the way. So how does this apply to the entire Hiram Page story and Oliver Cowdery and everybody else? What do you think?
I'd love to know. Hiram, what do you think, joining us here on Zoom?
With his awesome beard.
Mm-hmm.
If we could go back in time and look at his life, it seems like he started off with this very simple childhood trust, right? Lots of trust, just a little bit of knowledge. And he and Oliver and everybody else around him hit this crossover point with Joseph Smith, where they realized, wait a minute, we know a little bit more about him. He's still just a farmer, and we're so frustrated with him because he's not profiting the way that a prophet should profit, right? He's not doing this thing. And we see the hallmark of early church leaders is going through this stage of frustration, and thankfully for most of them, coming out the other side a little bit wiser for it. And I think this takes us to the final pro tip that we're going to talk about today. We've talked about several different pro tips for dealing with church history. Today we're introducing number 8. We're going to add this to the collection, and it simply goes like this: trust like a child, question like a teen, forgive like an adult, and teach like a guru. Trust like a child, question like a teen, forgive like an adult, teach like a guru. Jenny and John, if I can ask, what does that mean to you?
I like that a lot. Because I feel like those are all things that are completely appropriate. We talk about children going back to your previous slide about, the trust being high up and the knowledge being very low when we come into the world. And that's how it should be. The trust is there because it has to be as a matter of survival, right? It's not just trust, it's complete reliance on the adults around them.
Yeah.
So, and there's something very, very sweet about that innocence of children who who trust that their world is safe and beautiful, and that everything's going to be okay all the time. Questioning like a teen. None of us would be here having this discussion were it not for a teen who questioned. And that, it's important for us to remember, is not only age appropriate, but okay. It's a part of development. It's part of life. Forgive like an adult. Obviously, I am not a guru, so I think that I tend to currently relate more to this part, forgiving like an adult, because of what forgiveness brings in life in general, whether it's forgiveness of others or of ourselves. And then, teach like a guru. We should all be so lucky.
Or at the very least, every single one of us has something that we can share, right? And I think that's kind of the meta lesson that I'm hoping to share here today, which is that, this story is not just about Hiram Page and how the saints responded. It's a pattern for what we can learn and how we see that same pattern repeating for us today. Sometimes, like with this story, like I said, when I was a teen, I thought that the whole thing was about, seer stones, and seer stones are devil worshiping and don't use it, and that's bad. But that's not it. Sometimes we have caused problems by oversimplifying our church history, by reducing it to a black and white story. And sometimes we fail to include the nuances and the challenges that these people faced. And we therefore also fail how to teach how to deal with the nuance. So if we are leaders in this church, I hope that we do not fall into the trap of automatically discounting bottom-up revelation or lateral ideas or feedback. Because the reality is that a lot of the things in our church, like the primary program, the Sunday school program, seminary, the age change in missionaries, Relief Society, the length and style of temple garments, a lot of the temple ceremonies and the way that things happen inside temples, all of those things. A little book that you may have heard about called The Doctrine and Covenants, also The Pearl of Great Price, the Just Serve website, just to name a few. All of those were things that came from people besides the prophet. They initially were seeds planted by other people that came in sideways through that congregationalist mentality. So if we are a leader at the top, we need to have faith in the people around us and be willing to listen to their counsel. That's why they're counselors, right? We are not expected to be the smartest person in the room where it happens, or to have all of the answers all the time. Because sometimes when we as leaders are struggling to hear God's voice, sometimes that voice might sound like somebody else. It might sound like the sisters in the ward. It might sound like the kids around us. Now, if we are a follower in this church, I hope that we do not discount our own ability to contribute to the church just because we're not in positions of leadership. Please don't think that what I have to say won't matter, or I don't have to share my input, or I don't have to share my thoughts or my ideas or my opinions because I'm not the president, because they make the decisions. I hope that we would have faith. You have faith in yourselves and your talents and your abilities and the contributions that you can bring to the table. Don't wait to be told to do stuff, and please do not hold back the greatness that is in you. If we've been asked to let our light shine in whatever way it can, that's the gift that we have to offer our fellow humans. So I hope we keep being awesome and go light the dark.
Thank you, Ben. Just like we talked about last week, you don't need to have authority to have influence. And I just love what you shared today. Thank you so much for that. Thanks to everyone who participated. We've really appreciated your support throughout this time. And we look forward to meeting with you again next week. Next week will be Sunday, March 28th. Mm-hmm. The lesson is called Jesus Christ Will Gather His People. And it covers Doctrine and Covenants, section 29. It's a long section, but it's just the one. And so we will meet back here again, regular time. Again, thanks to John for all that you do, John, behind the scenes and in front of the scenes and throughout the scenes. Thank you to Ben for all your preparation, your thoughtfulness, your hard work, your insight. And thank you to everyone who has, again, participated, whether listening, making comments. We really appreciate you. Hope you have a great week, and we will see you again next time.
Thanks, everybody.